Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to today's podcast. Today we'll be talking about the launching of the new United States nation. You can see your I can statement there, our objective for today. By the end of this podcast, you should be able to summarize how President Washington and Congress worked together to start the new national government. Now, the first thing that we're going to be talking about is how President Washington and members of Congress established a new national government. Really, that's what we're looking for to be proficient with this objective. The main ideas that we need to be thinking about are how in 1789 George Washington became the first president of the United States, how Congress and the president organized the executive and judicial branches of government, and how Americans had very high expectations for their new nation, especially President Washington. Now, Americans viewed George Washington as an honest man. They thought he was a hero of the American Revolution. And in fact, when George Washington was first suggested that he should become the first president of the United States, he didn't like the idea. He wanted to retire to his home in Virginia, his farm on Mount Vernon. But many of his friends would not allow that to happen. One of his friend, a fellow politician, Governor Morris, told him that should George Washington not become the president, it would be fatal to the new government. That the United States government would not be able to last without George Washington as the first president of the United States. He told his friend Washington that of all men, you are the best fitted to serve that office. So Washington was basically talked into being president by his friends. Electors from the 11 states that had passed the Constitution met in January of 1789 to vote. Now, the people of the state get to decide which electors are sent, but the Electoral College is actually the ones who decide who is going to become president. The number of electors that a state gets is the same number of representatives that they have in Congress. So the larger your population, the more electors you get to determine who is the president. You can watch that for the upcoming presidential elections. The electors unanimously voted President Washington, and they picked John Adams to be his vice president. First Lady Martha Washington entertained people during social events in the White House. Now, some people in the new nation believe that women should play a greater role in the country than what Martha Washington did. Martha Washington was sort of a traditionalist. She believed that women should support the household, and she had made the comment that since she had moved to Washington to become the First Lady, she had hardly had 1/2 hour to herself since she got there. She did run the presidential household in style. It was not yet the White House. The White House was not actually built until later. But there were other women of the time period, such as an author named Judith Sargent Murray, who believed that women needed to play a greater role in the new nation. Murray, along with Abigail Adams and others, believed in a concept called Republican motherhood, the idea that women should play an important role in teaching their children about becoming good citizens. And they hoped that this Republican motherhood idea would eventually lead towards greater rights and greater freedoms for women, such as the right to vote. Now, Washington begins leading the new nation, and Congress helps him to kind of get started on exactly what it is that the executive branch is supposed to be doing. The Constitution is very, very specific about what the legislative branch can do and how Congress should be made up and what Congress should be doing, but it's not nearly as specific about the executive branch. So Washington, along with the new Congress, have to figure that out as they go along. Washington knew that a lot of the decisions that he was going to be making were going to become precedents, which sets an example for future actions. Washington noted he sent a letter to his friend James Madison, and he said that the first of everything in our situation will serve to establish a precedent. Washington knew that everything he did was going to set an example for how things should be done in the future. Some of those examples that Washington sets are very simple. They include things like, what would we call the president? There are some citizens who believed that the president should have a very long and very formal name. For example, some people believed that it should be very simple, such as President Washington. Some people believed that the official term for the president should be His Highness the President of the United States and Protector of the Rights of the Same. So can you imagine saying that every time that you say the president's name? Washington made it known that he preferred the simpler titles such as Mr. President or President Washington, so that's still what we call the president today. Congress works with the president to establish a cabinet, which is a group of advisors. These are executive departments, the departments that answer to the president and help the president enforce the laws. These are departments such as the Department of State, or the Secretary of State, or the Department of the Treasury, led by the Secretary of Treasury, Alexander Hamilton. Secretary of State was led by Thomas Jefferson. These are two very important cabinet members for the first president. Washington also set a few other precedents, such as having an inauguration ceremony or how the president would dress. Some people felt like maybe the president should wear big flowery robes, but other people didn't want him to look like a king. So Washington made it known that the president would be dressing in business professional, which is the reason why even today you see our presidents wearing suits. Now, along with the executive branch, the Constitution was not very specific about how the judicial branch should be set up. So Congress passes the Judiciary Act of 1789, and it sets up the federal court system. It creates 3 levels of federal courts, and it defines the powers for each one, with the Supreme Court being the top of that system. It sets up federal district courts and circuit courts of appeals. So, for example, if a law is disputed, it starts off in the lowest levels of federal district court before it goes to the circuit courts of appeals, before it eventually may be heard by the Supreme Court, although the Supreme Court only hears a fraction of the laws that are a fraction of the court cases that are appealed to it today. The president nominates federal judges, and this was a position that George Washington took very, very seriously. Now, when George Washington becomes president, the United States has roughly 4 million people. This is in 1790. Most of them were farmers who wanted fair tax laws and the right to settle on western lands, such as the Northwest Territory that we talked a little bit about last unit. Some of them, however, were merchants or laborers, craftspeople who wanted help with their businesses. Remember, this is during the Industrial Revolution that we've already studied. So there are a few people who believe that the future of the United States is in big cities, manufacturing, and trading, whereas other people believe that the United States should be based on a farming or agriculture community. This is one of the major disputes of American politics during the 1790s and early 1800s. The first capital of the United States was New York City. It was a trade center already. It was an economic hub of the nation. Roughly 33,000 people were living there at the time, and it was growing very, very rapidly. You can kind of see here in a picture of what New York would have looked like in 1790. However, roughly 97% of their 4 million people lived on farms, not in major cities. That will bring us to the end of the podcast for objective number 1. There are some review questions here that I would like you to take a look at. Make sure you have answers to these in your notes. Be prepared to oral defense these questions, because if you're not, then you may need to go back through your podcast, watch it again, maybe take some more careful notes. You need to be able to list at least 3 precedents set by George Washington. You should be able to summarize the role that Martha Washington and other women played in the new government. Explain what the cabinet is and who the important people were in Washington's cabinet. Explain how the Judiciary Act of 1789 set up the new national government. And finally, you should review the rubric and the objective sheet. Make sure that you do a self-assessment when you're